My name is Chloe. I am 27 years old, and I reside with my husband, Nathan, in a little wooden house on the periphery of Asheville, North Carolina. People frequently remark that our dwelling appears romantic, like a serene painting nestled among tall pine trees with the sound of birdsong in the morning. They describe us as the ideal couple, Nathan with his inviting smile, and me, always gently ambling beside him during our evening walks around the lake. But that was simply an attractive veil I once endeavored to keep from being drawn back. We have been married for 1 year, a duration long enough to comprehend that affection lacking candor and consideration will decay in the unspoken tension no one dares to disrupt. When we initially encountered one another, Nathan was like a gentle vernal breeze. He was considerate and tender, consistently making me feel as though I were the sole woman in the world. He entered my life one evening at a local art exhibition where I was employed as a program coordinator and a children's art instructor. I previously believed that discovering a man who genuinely understood me was a great blessing. I was mistaken. 6 months following our wedding, Nathan ceased to provide me with a feeling of safety. He would return home later, sometimes without uttering a word, merely dropping his bag on a chair and increasing the television's volume. On some nights, when I attempted to inquire about his day, he would only glance at me, nod unenthusiastically, and then retreat into quietude. I became unaware of when the warmth in his gaze had been supplanted by a chilling quality that instilled apprehension in me. I recollect the first instance he addressed me with that severe tone, asking, "Can you cease feigning? No one requires you to act happy." I was immobilized. In that instant, I had no comprehension of what I had done incorrectly. I did not depart immediately because I still harbored hope. Each time Nathan softened, embraced me, and said, "I'm just tired," I would persuade myself that everything would be satisfactory. I began to assign culpability to myself, wondering if I was excessively sensitive or perhaps deficient. However, irrespective of how diligently I tried to maintain dinner conversations or elementary moments of connection, everything would relapse into silence. One day, I prepared his preferred meatball soup, lit candles, and played the music he treasured. He entered the kitchen, glanced at the table, and silently opened the refrigerator to retrieve a soda. "Don't overdo it, Chloe," he observed without even looking at me, adding, "Everything you're attempting is futile." My heart felt devastated, not by his words, but by his palpable lack of concern. I started to feel like an alien in my own residence. Every morning upon awakening, I confronted a choice between maintaining silence to preserve tranquility or speaking up and receiving that same frigid stare from the man I once trusted. The tenderness we once shared existed only in my memory, and I felt entirely disoriented in this marriage. Then, on our first wedding anniversary, Nathan instructed me to pack a bag, declaring he had a surprise. "A journey," he stated. "I want us to return to where it all commenced, where we first camped together." Something unreadable flickered in Nathan's eyes as he spoke. I was bewildered, but I consented, clinging to a fragment of hope, even as uncertainty filled my heart. Perhaps this was the inception of something new, but deep down, I could not dispel the escalating disquiet. I was oblivious that this trip would mark the moment I would be irrevocably changed. Nathan chose Pine Grove Falls, located over 2 hours from our home and nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. This was where he had taken me on our first camping trip after we met. I remember sitting on a moss laden rock, my hand in his, listening to the roar of the waterfall, which sounded like nature's own grand performance. I reasoned that if any place could rekindle emotions, it was there. We set off early, and during the drive, I tried to initiate discussions. But Nathan provided only brief, aloof replies, barely glancing at me. Familiar country tunes played in the vehicle, but unlike previous times, neither of us sang along. The quietude was so profound I could discern my own heartbeat with every increase in speed. When we turned onto the unpaved path leading to the trail, a chill permeated my chest despite the summer's heat. Nathan parked beneath a large oak tree, then retrieved a rucksack and water bottle from the car's boot, saying, "Let's proceed. It's not distant." While still avoiding my gaze, the path was steep but surrounded by tall trees, and everything appeared calm and still. I followed him in silence, disregarding the harsh sunlight reflecting off his dark blue shirt, the one I had presented to him the previous Christmas. As we approached the waterfall, its thunderous sound echoed through the forest, powerful, overwhelming, and resonant. Nothing had altered, including the identical stone ledge by the falls and the same maple tree casting shadows on the limpid water. I moved nearer to the precipice and took a deep inhalation. "We used to sit here," I murmured, endeavoring to retain a piece of what we once had. Nathan stood behind me, silent. Then his voice emerged, deeper and altered. "Chloe, have you ever pondered if circumstances would have differed if it hadn't all commenced here?" I turned around, perplexed, asking, "What do you signify?" A gust of wind swept through, tossing my hair, as his eyes, no longer cold but vacant, locked onto mine. "I've been contemplating a great deal," Nathan declared in a monotone, as if rehearsed, "about existence, erroneous decisions, being ensnared." I retreated a step, my palms starting to moisten. "Nathan, if something is amiss, we can converse. We can." But he interrupted me, his eyes at last meeting mine. "No, Chloe, we cannot. I didn't bring you here to amend anything. I came to terminate it." I did not even have an opportunity to process before it transpired. Nathan advanced, his hand on my shoulder, not tenderly, but with an abrupt shove that caused me to lose equilibrium. I felt my body incline backward, the sound of the waterfall roaring in my ears, muffling my scream. In a moment, the sky inverted, and I impacted the frigid water as astonishment took precedence. I flailed, battling to reach the surface, the slick rocks beneath offering no purchase as water inundated my mouth and nose. I was overcome with panic. But amidst the pandemonium, a faint voice resonated in my mind, my mother's voice. "Remain calm, Chloe. Do not resist the water. Permit it to convey you." I closed my eyes and compelled my body to relax, sensing myself drifting with the current, unsure how long it took before my hand grasped a floating bough. I hauled myself onto a mossy embankment, trembling and disoriented. My attire was tattered, my palms abraded, my breath labored, but I was still animate. And in that instant, between the surging water and wind in the trees, I knew one thing: Nathan was not incensed. He had meticulously planned it. Every step, every particular, and he did not desire my return. But I was still present, I was not concluded, and I would not allow matters to end as he intended. I dragged myself along the stream bank, soaked garments adhering to me, my knees lacerated, and hands excoriated from clutching slippery roots and stones. Every step felt like pulling a dead weight. But I did not desist. I could not. Because Nathan believed I was gone. And if I revealed myself too early, he would triumph. After nearly an hour of navigating through dense undergrowth, I discerned a narrow track with tire marks. And in the distance, I heard an engine, a lifeline drawing me from the brink of terror. I limped toward the sound, emerged from the trees, waving frantically, my throat parched as I vociferated, "Please, stop!" Bütün bütün A corroded old pickup truck screeched to a halt a few meters away, and a man in his 50s sporting a plaid shirt and a baseball cap leaped out, exclaiming, "Good heavens, are you all right?" I nodded feebly, clutching the vehicle door, and stated, I fell near Pine Grove Falls. Please, do not inquire further. I just need to telephone a friend." Without any reluctance, he opened the passenger door and assisted me in. introducing himself as Bill and mentioning he resided nearby. He indicated a small roadside eatery down the road, where the reception was superior, and offered to transport me there. I uttered no further words during the journey. Only one name resounded in my thoughts: Grace, the sole individual I trusted, my closest confidant since university. I was certain if anyone could assist me, it was she. When we reached the diner, I borrowed Bill's telephone and dialed Grace. Chloe. Her voice was filled with alarm. Oh my goodness. What is amiss with your voice? No time, I responded. Nathan attempted to harm me. Can you come and collect me? I'm at Pine Grove Deli, approximately an hour outside Asheville. Please do not inform anyone. She remained silent for a moment, then declared resolutely, I am en route. Keep the line active. Do not terminate the call. Bill provided me with a woolen cardigan and brought over a mug of hot chocolate, and then he quietly seated himself in a corner without posing a single query. I sat there grasping the cup, my eyes staring vacantly at the misted pane. I knew profoundly, ever since the instant Nathan propelled me over that waterfall, I was no longer the identical Chloe. A little over an hour later, the diner door swung open and Grace entered, her eyes surveying the room until they settled on me. She froze, then hastened over and enveloped me in a tremulous embrace, saying, Chloe, I presumed you. I am all right. I am still here, I rejoined. But Nathan believes I am not, and I need to maintain that situation. On the return drive, I narrated everything to Grace. My voice was hoarse, but the recollections were ingrained in my mind. She did not interject, merely held my hand firmly. When we arrived at Grace's residence, a compact third-floor apartment in a tranquil complex, she enveloped me in warm blankets and administered analgesics. Are you going to contact the constabulary? She inquired. I shook my head. Not at present. If I report it now, Nathan will refute everything. And who is going to believe a spouse who abruptly reappears after vanishing? Grace exhaled deeply. So what is your stratagem? To feign demise, I stated unequivocally. I require time to amass evidence, secure legal counsel, and expose him the proper way. Grace nodded deliberately. Very well. You are not by yourself. I support you. 3 days subsequently, we had devised a scheme. Grace's Aunt Lorraine resided alone in the Smoky Mountains, where cellular reception was poor and visitors were infrequent, so I would sojourn there under an assumed appellation. Grace would gather my belongings, obliterate my traces, and disseminate the information that I went missing following a hiking excursion. That evening, as I gazed at the dim illumination filtering through the draperies, I knew the contest had commenced. Nathan had selected his role as the bereaved widower, and I would be the silent agency rewriting the entire drama. I was no longer the woman quivering in the frigid water. I was a survivor, and I was resolved to make him confront every secret he believed was irretrievably interred. Lorraine's diminutive wooden cabin was situated concealed in the nebulous, Smoky Mountain woodland, nearly 20 miles from the closest township. There was no cellular service, no internet, and no one was aware of my presence except Grace. It was so tranquil I could hear the wind sough through the windows each night, the sound of my own heartbeat reverberating in the vacant chamber, and all the uninvited recollections infiltrating. I spent the initial 3 weeks simply recuperating. My knee required 8 sutures, my shoulder was contused, and my palms were abraded from clawing at tree roots attempting to ascend. But corporeal pain was inconsequential compared to what I carried within. Every time I closed my eyes, I envisioned Nathan's countenance as he pushed me, not frenzied or out of control, but cold and premeditated, certain no one would ever ascertain the truth. But I was alive, and I was not about to permit this to fade into oblivion. Grace became my vital connection to the external world. She returned to my flat with Nathan, feigning the retrieval of a few old possessions. With meticulous exactitude, she surreptitiously extracted my laptop, a strong box of important documents concealed behind a counterfeit drawer, and an external hard drive I utilized to back up everything: photographs, voice recordings, journals, scans of text messages. In Lorraine's garret room, I reconstructed everything: chronologies, memories, particulars of a marriage that appeared placid on the surface. On the laptop, I discovered electronic mails from Nathan to a woman named Rachel W.T. There's messages, often alluding to "once this is concluded." I did not know her identity, but something indicated Rachel was pivotal. I examined old photographs, including contusions on my wrists and mirror selfies I captured whenever Nathan became enraged. Once, I even recorded a brief video of him vociferating at me over burnt eggs. I retained it as substantiation in case something adverse ever transpired, never anticipating it would become indispensable to a future strategy. Grace connected me with an attorney named Elijah Turner, a domestic abuse specialist in his 30s who grew up observing his mother's suffering. We communicated via encrypted electronic mails and a secure platform Elijah established to maintain the secrecy of my location. Each day elapsed with tension and meticulous planning. I could not permit a single error as we commenced assembling witnesses. Grace contacted Amanda, a former colleague who once observed Nathan shouting at me during a gallery meeting, and Amanda consented to compose a statement detailing how I had departed mid-meeting, clearly alarmed. Elijah insisted on absolute discretion, no public action, no intimation that I was alive. If you desire to deliver the decisive blow, he advised, allow him to believe he is prevailing. And he did. Grace forwarded me a text message Nathan had sent her. Perhaps Chloe met with an accident, but if she genuinely vanished, maybe that constitutes a peaceful resolution. I read that line repeatedly, every word piercing my heart. He was not grieving, he was not frightened. Nathan was enacting the culpable husband whose wife disappeared, and that only strengthened my resolve to remove that disguise before he took another action. One night, as the wind buffeted the roof, I telephoned Elijah using the secure line. I have a concept, I stated. I want him to reveal his true nature. Chloe, that is perilous. If he ascertains you are alive, that is why it must be subtle, I interjected. I will not appear, but we will lead him to believe someone out there possesses more knowledge than he apprehended. Before I envisaged the snare: an anonymous missive, a mysterious note in Nathan's letterbox, a fictitious witness asserting they saw me after the disappearance, a psychological ploy to unsettle him. We initiated with the most straightforward maneuver: an unmarked envelope in Nathan's letterbox containing a blurred, distant photograph of a woman at a bus stop in Waynesville with curly hair and a beige cardigan, her head slightly lowered, not distinct enough to confirm it was me, but sufficient to discompose someone who believed I was deceased. The photograph was accompanied by a handwritten note in blue ink. Chloe is not beneath the waterfall, as you presume. I did not slumber the night we dispatched that through Grace. It was the inaugural step in causing Nathan to walk into his own ensnarement. Days later, Grace received a communication from an unknown number with no name or introduction. Just a single line: "You are aware of something. She did not actually perish." We knew he was beginning to fracture. Elijah and I orchestrated our subsequent move: a fabricated witness. He engaged a man named Harvey, a retired private investigator who now undertook freelance civil assignments, to pose as a lorry driver who asserted to have picked up a woman resembling Chloe on the motorway weeks after I vanished. The rumor disseminated rapidly, not through news outlets, but among individuals who knew me and Nathan. Indications were dispersed. like a peculiar call to my former place of employment and an anonymous social media post inquiring if anyone recalled a young woman named Chloe from Asheville. Then, what we had been anticipating transpired. Nathan telephoned Harvey. The initial call was succinct, merely probing. But by the third call, Nathan had arranged a rendezvous at a public house in the suburbs with no surveillance cameras. Elijah had prepared Harvey thoroughly. He wore a miniature recording device on his belt and a specialized watch that logged time and location. That evening, I sat immobilized in Lorraine's cabin, clutching my telephone as if it might shatter, each minute feeling as though my lungs were being constricted. Then Harvey transmitted the recording. Nathan's voice was clearly audible above the hum of the public house. If you genuinely saw her, and if you remain silent, I will ensure you are compensated. But if not, let us just say you never observed anything. Harvey inquired. Are you requesting me to maintain silence about seeing your wife? Nathan responded. I am requesting you not to jeopardize what is already established. I quivered as I listened. Those words were not merely evidence. They were the unraveling trepidation of a man who thought he had concealed his transgression, now attempting to obscure it with money and intimidation. Elijah dispatched the audio directly to the authorities, and with the assistance of an investigator named Marissa, who specialized in domestic abuse cases, an official case file was initiated. I had not yet emerged from concealment, but now I was no longer a missing person. I was a living deponent, and I possessed my first tangible piece of evidence. 3 days later, an undercover officer approached Nathan, masquerading as one of Harvey's old acquaintances, and their conversation was monitored. This time, Nathan inadvertently revealed information, referencing the day at Pine Grove Falls. He did not state precisely what occurred, but the phrase, matters proceeded more smoothly than I anticipated, was sufficient to raise alarms. I listened to that recording 5 times in a single night. And each time, I perceived the truth more distinctly. The man I once called my spouse had not just attempted to obliterate me, he believed he had been successful. And that hubris those errors, every tainted dollar and hushed utterance, would precipitate his downfall. I gazed out the window as the trees stood motionless, like silent confederates in my quiet retribution. Elijah telephoned, his voice composed. We possess sufficient evidence, and you still do not have to reveal your presence. Allow him to proceed just a little further until he propels himself off the precipice. I did not respond immediately. I looked toward the moonlight filtering through the pines and envisaged the day Nathan would sit in an interrogation chamber, hearing his own voice attempt to negotiate with the truth. I smiled and declared, let us persist. This occasion, I shall triumph. I returned to Asheville on a brisk autumnal morning, the foliage lining the thoroughfares glowing golden. It had been nearly 3 months since the day I was thrust over Pine Grove Falls. 3 months in seclusion, accumulating proof, observing from a distance, awaiting the opportune moment, and now that moment had arrived. I was not the petrified woman drowning in trepidation. I was back for a singular purpose to confront the truth and ensure Nathan faced accountability. Grace met me at the bus terminus, her countenance taut with apprehension and relief. Are you certain? She inquired, gripping the steering wheel as we departed. I nodded. There is no retracing steps. I have been prepared for this day. Elijah had already arranged a meeting with the city's police department, where we would submit everything, the recordings of Nathan and Harvey, photographs of my injuries, witness testimonies, and most crucially, the electronic correspondence between Nathan and Rachel, demonstrating something was gravely amiss. The Special Investigations Unit accepted the case, and within 2 days, Nathan was summoned in connection with the unexplained vanishing of his wife. That morning, I entered the waiting area with trembling hands. Elijah led the way, conversing with the officers while I sat beside Grace. The room was clinical, humming with cold fluorescent illumination, and all I could contemplate was that kitchen long ago when Nathan stood behind me and whispered, You do not need to be privy to too much. Now he would comprehend that sensation. A youthful officer emerged and called my name. I stood, my legs unsteady, but my heart palpitating with a peculiar new cadence, part apprehension, part something more potent. The interrogation room was diminutive, with a single wooden table, three chairs, and a camera in the corner. Nathan was already present, his posture erect, hands folded neatly in his lap. Attired in a white shirt and a pale gray necktie, his countenance serene as if at a business conference. But when I entered, he turned. His eyes flickered towards me, and then he became immobile. We regarded each other for a segment of time that felt more protracted than a year, neither of us uttering a sound, until Nathan finally articulated silently, "Chloe, you." I sat down and took a profound respiration. "Yes, I am still alive." The investigator positioned between us commenced the interrogation. "Mr. Nathan Myers, are you aware of why we requested your presence today?" Nathan inhaled, then nodded. "It pertains to my wife's disappearance." I leaned forward. "Or does it pertain to the fact that you attempted to murder me?" Nathan flinched, turning to me, his composed demeanor faltering. "No, you slipped. I endeavored to, but you would not heed." "What about the recording?" Elijah interjected, sliding a folder towards the investigator. "The statement. Matters proceeded more smoothly than I anticipated. Or the part where you offered a stranger monetary compensation to remain silent? Everything subsequent felt like observing a cinematic sequence in slow motion." Nathan denied everything, asserted I was paranoid, and claimed I had concocted it. But incrementally, it all surfaced: photographs, statements, handwritten threats, and finally, the recording of him negotiating with Harvey at the public house. Nathan's face turned ashen. Perspiration beaded on his temples. He stammered, fidgeted in his seat, then finally slammed his hand on the table. "Very well, I concede, but I did not intend to kill her. I merely wanted her out of my life." The room fell silent. I turned to the investigator. "I am officially pressing charges against Nathan Myers for attempted endangerment, psychological abuse, and conspiracy to conceal the truth." Nathan was handcuffed at that very moment, his head lowered, not uttering another syllable. As he walked past me, his eyes were no longer irate, just lost and devoid of power. I watched him depart, not experiencing triumph or acrimony, just an overwhelming sense of lightness, as if I had finally relinquished a burden that had oppressed me for far too long. Grace embraced me in the corridor. "You achieved it, Chloe." I squeezed her hand gently and whispered, "No, this is merely the inception." Because now I was not just going to survive, I was going to live completely, anchored in the truth I fought to reclaim. The trial was set for mid-December, a winter that commenced early in Asheville, bringing dense fog and somber skies, but within me, a quiet conflagration still burned. I was no longer fearful, I was not indecisive. This time, I would not just narrate my account, I would render it irrefutable. The Buncombe County Courthouse stood in the city's core, an ancient stone edifice with a lofty dome and substantial walls that seemed to murmur the reverberations of 100 preceding trials. On the inaugural day, I sat in the witness waiting area, my palms frigid, but my gaze fixed on the door ahead. Grace sat beside me, her hand gently resting on my shoulder. "Regardless of what transpires," she remarked, "you accomplish something most individuals never find the fortitude to do." I turned to her and whispered, "I cannot alter the past, but I can safeguard my future." Yet Nathan was escorted into the courtroom by two officers. He was attired in a light gray suit, his head lowered, but I knew he still believed this was a misapprehension he could elucidate, but not on this occasion. There was no retractings. The prosecutor initiated by delineating the events. from the ostensibly flawless marriage to the fissures, and ultimately my disappearance. Then came the tangible evidence, the recording, the injury photographs, text messages, and printed electronic mails, every particular piercing through the facade Nathan had constructed. Then it was my turn. I approached the stand with trembling limbs, but a voice steadier than ever, and recounted my story. I narrated how I met Nathan, the manner in which he first regarded me during that art workshop, the affectionate things he used to whisper each night. And then I spoke of the transformations, the cold stares, the sarcasm that devolved into affronts, the silence that pervaded our kitchen. I described the morning he instructed me to pack, the excursion to Pine Grove Falls, how he smiled and then propelled me, without reluctance. I did not weep or succumb to emotion. I allowed the truth to articulate itself, because the truth possesses sufficient potency on its own. When the defense cross examined, they endeavored to instill doubt, proposing, "Perhaps you slipped, perhaps it was not deliberate." I looked them directly in the eye and stated resolutely, "No one merely slips after declaring, 'I came here to terminate things.'" My witnesses followed. Harvey described the recorded rendezvous. Amanda, my former co-worker, spoke about Nathan vociferating in the gallery. And even a neighbor corroborated hearing violent altercations from our apartment on numerous nights. Each testimony constructed an image that no one could gainsay. The trial endured for 4 days. On the concluding day, Nathan was permitted to speak. He arose, his eyes no longer sharp, but vacant and depleted. "I did not anticipate it would reach this extent. I simply felt ensnared," he articulated. "But I will not deny my actions, and if there is a penance to be paid, I shall pay it." When the jury returned, the courtroom held its collective breath. The judge arose, his voice resonating through the stillness. "We find the defendant Nathan Myers culpable of attempted endangerment, psychological and physical abuse of his wife, Chloe Myers. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment." I did not shed tears or smile. I simply closed my eyes and took the most profound breath I had taken in years, the air finally feeling unburdened. Grace embraced me fervently in the courthouse lobby. "I am proud of you, not for triumphing, but for maintaining your stance." I nodded. I never required triumph. I simply needed to be heard. For the first time in months, I stood in public devoid of fear, devoid of shame. I was a witness, a survivor, a woman narrating her own account. 3 months following the trial, I still resided in Grace's apartment. Not due to a need for shelter, but because I was not prepared to return to that former dwelling. What once felt like a home now only contained fragmented recollections. Instead, I commenced writing, not to solicit pity, but to articulate truth. Sharing my narrative on a personal blog initially just to organize my thoughts. But within weeks, I began to receive correspondence from women across the nation. They referred to me as the voice for the unspoken. One wrote she had endured silence for 7 years. Another mentioned she believed leaving was futile until my story empowered her to choose herself. I read every word, and for the first time in a considerable period, I did not merely feel like a survivor. I felt acknowledged. That is when the concept for a community initiative began to crystallize. I possessed no experience in managing an organization, but I had one unambiguous objective: to establish a secure haven, not merely a refuge, but a space for emotional recuperation for those who had undergone what I had. I named the organization New Haven Path. Grace was the first to enlist without reluctance. Elijah assisted in connecting us with a network of attorneys specializing in abuse survivors, and Lorraine, Grace's aunt who once provided me sanctuary in the mountains, offered her cabin as the initial emergency support facility. It was not without challenges: legal documentation, fundraising, grant applications, and I experienced self-doubt on more than one occasion. Then I received an electronic mail from a woman named Celeste in Florida. She wrote, "I have perused everything you have posted. My husband never physically assaulted me, but he controlled every aspect: finances, telephone, friendships. I presumed I was simply overly sensitive. But owing to you, I comprehended I possessed the right to live fully. Thank you for bestowing upon me the courage I could not find independently. I sat in silence for hours after reading that, and I knew this was no longer merely a notion, it was a calling. 3 months later, New Haven Path officially commenced operations in Asheville, initiating with an anonymous support line, trauma recovery groups, and professionally facilitated workshops. Every week, I personally handle at least 2 calls, not in the capacity of a counselor, but as someone who has been in their precise circumstances. I never assert, I understand your feelings. I only state, I endured, and you can too. Information about the organization disseminated following an article in the Asheville Citizen Times, succeeded by an interview on local television. In that segment, I shared my account. Although I did not concentrate on the event at Pine Grove Falls, I spoke more extensively about the apprehension of silence, about the sensation of living in a relationship devoid of shouting, but where every day feels like treading on fractured glass. The broadcast concluded with my words: silence does not equate to peace, and no one merits living in fear within their own residence. The subsequent week, we received over 200 electronic mails. One woman from Colorado telephoned at 3 a.m., stating she was deliberating between remaining and departing. I conversed with her for an hour, reiterating just one sentiment: you are not embarking on this journey alone. There are individuals awaiting you on the other side of fear. Recognized I could not rescue the entire world, but I could facilitate the initial step for those still seeking an escape. 1 year subsequent to the trial, I stood in the auditorium of a substantial community center in Charlotte before hundreds of individual survivors, advocates, attorneys, students, and journalists. I had been invited to speak at the commencement of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I ascended the stage, the illumination shining directly into my eyes. But I was no longer apprehensive. I looked down at the front row, where Grace, Elijah, Lorraine, and women who had once emerged from the shadows through New Haven Path sat observing. I declared, my name is Chloe, and I was propelled off a waterfall in my own existence, but I swam back, not merely to survive, but to assist others in reaching the shore. The room erupted in applause, but the most distinct sound I perceived was a small voice within me, whispering, you did not remain silent, and consequently, others do not have to either. 1 year following Nathan's sentencing, I returned to Pine Grove Falls, the location where everything almost concluded. However, this time, I did not arrive unaccompanied. Beside me was Grace, steadfast like a beacon in a tempest, and around me were 6 women who had once entered New Haven Path with trepidation in their eyes and fractured hearts. They originated from diverse places: Oklahoma, Georgia, even New Jersey, each carrying a distinct narrative, but sharing one commonality: they did not relinquish hope in themselves. I returned to Pine Grove not to confront my recollections, but to conclude a chapter, not with oblivion, but with fortitude. The trail to the falls remained unaltered, rugged and strewn with fallen foliage, and the sound of rushing water was just as resonant as the first time I heard it, the moment I was propelled. But now the waterfall's roar was not foreboding. It was the pulsation of liberty, the sound that reminded me I was still present, more resilient than ever. We paused at the large boulder, the final place I saw Nathan's countenance, before I plunged into the frigid water. I reached into my coat pocket and extracted a small velvet coffer, my hand trembling slightly as I opened it. Inside lay my wedding circlet, still weighty and silent like the years I spent cherishing a man who once seemed like everything, until I learned that affection is insufficient to preserve an individual's humanity. I held the ring, the cold metal against my skin, recalling that autumnal afternoon when he slid it onto my finger beneath golden trees. I had believed it was the inception of eternity, never envisioning that same hand would one day thrust me off a precipice without admonition. I regarded everyone around me. Grace gave a slight nod, her eyes conveying, "You have progressed significantly. It is time." I tightened my grasp on the ring, then opened my palm at the edge of the boulder. "I am leaving this here," I stated deliberately. "Not because I have forgotten, but because I forgive myself." And then I released it. The ring descended, catching the late afternoon sun before vanishing into the surging current. No reverberation, no response. Just a peculiar stillness, as if nature itself had accepted the silent valediction. One of the women, Jenna, who once absconded from her state with only two sets of attire and an infant in her arms, stepped beside me. She uttered nothing. She retrieved from her pocket a fractured necklace, once forcibly removed from her neck during an altercation, dropped it after the ring, and whispered, "That is the final occasion I permit that memory to constrain me." Sequentially, each woman came forward with something diminutive: a comb, a folded missive, an old keychain. No one inquired as to the reason. No one needed to, as each item constituted a farewell. As dusk descended, we sat together on the ancient stone ledge, partaking in bread and hot tea. No one spoke of the men who had inflicted harm upon them, or recounted the anguish that had once brought them to their knees. Instead, we conversed about the future, about inaugurating another center near Charlotte, about a young woman who had written expressing a desire to volunteer, about Grace's forthcoming speaking engagement. When we departed the falls, I turned back one final time. The water was placid, as if it had never engulfed anyone. I placed a hand over my chest, feeling my heart beat. No longer agitated or constricted, I had returned to where everything nearly terminated, to initiate something novel. In the vehicle, Grace inquired softly, "How do you feel?" I smiled, not turning back, my gaze fixed on the fading pines, like I am finally not burdened by what never rightfully belonged to me. It was voracious. That day, I did not merely relinquish a ring, I let go of apprehension, of anger, of culpability I never merited carrying. One January afternoon, I sat in solitude in the second floor conference room of the New Haven Path Center in Asheville. Outside, snow descended gently, like old recollections that visit intermittently, reminding me I once weathered the most frigid winter of my existence. On the table lay the speech I had prepared for the upcoming National Conference on Victim Advocacy in Washington, D. C. I see. I had been invited as a representative of an independent organization that had assisted more than 400 women in the preceding year to reclaim their lives, a figure I once deemed unattainable when all this commenced with a personal blog. I reread the concluding lines of my draft. I stand here not as a protagonist, but as an overcomer. I speak not solely for myself, but for the women who still cannot, for those behind secure doors cradling their children, hearts racing, believing silence is the sole means of survival. They need to be cognizant. They are not alone. I paused, struck out the word survivor, and substituted it with overcomer. Because by now I comprehended something: overcoming is not merely surviving, it is the act of reclaiming the entitlement to live, to dream, to love freely. In recent months, we had inaugurated two new branches in Charlotte and Knoxville. Grace now supervises the eastern region, while Jenna, the same woman who returned to Pine Grove with me, has become one of our principal counselors. She once remarked to me during a team meeting, "Chloe, you did not just rescue me. You provided me an opportunity to rescue myself, and now I wish to extend that to someone else." Ikoyi. And I did not respond immediately. I just nodded and mused. If there is one objective I possess in this life, it might be encapsulated in that sentence. I received a letter of gratitude from a young woman named Emily, merely 19 years of age, who surreptitiously gathered evidence and departed after 3 years with a boyfriend 10 years her senior, who controlled everything. In her letter, she wrote, "You have never encountered me, But because of you, I summoned the courage to walk through the doors of New Haven Path. I no longer refer to it as absconding, I call it returning home. I printed her letter, framed it, and displayed it in the corridor of our center. Every time I pass by, I pause for a few seconds, not to experience pride, but to remind myself those words are the reason I will never desist. Recently, I was invited to join a legislative committee in North Carolina to propose new policies for safeguarding abuse survivors during legal proceedings. Elijah accompanied me to the initial hearing, as he has consistently been the quiet fortitude behind our legal endeavors. After the session, he leaned in and remarked, Chloe, you are no longer just a voice for survivors, you are transforming the way the system perceives them. I was at a loss for words, but in my heart, I felt profound thankfulness, grateful that I lived, that I asserted myself, and that I chose not to remain silent. One evening, back at home, I opened an old photograph I had taken at Pine Grove Falls before everything transpired. In the image, I am youthful, brimming with hope, oblivious I was standing on the tenuous boundary between affection and betrayal. I looked into that young woman's eyes and softly uttered, Thank you for not letting go. Mm. And then I deactivated the screen and gazed out the window, where snow was falling lightly onto the roof, each white flake covering minor fissures, like time mending what once felt impossible to repair. I had triumphed, not merely in court, but in the odyssey through myself. And more than anything, I knew this was not the denouement. This was the commencement of a new chapter where I persist in fighting, persist in listening, and persist in being a voice for those who still cannot articulate. Because some lives are still awaiting a spark in the midst of winter, and I will be the one to ignite it. My narrative is not solely about eluding a painful matrimony. It is testament to the strength and resilience and choosing to ascend. From survivor to inspiration, I have assisted hundreds of women in breaking their silence. New Haven Path is not just an organization, it is an emblem of hope, where wounds are acknowledged and healing commences. And I know, irrespective of the length of the path ahead, I will continue walking, both for myself and for those still waiting to discover their voice. What are your reflections on Chloe's journey and the choices she made? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to follow the channel for more potent, emotional, and inspiring narratives about life, family, and Renaissance.